The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Jennifer Schaus, and welcome to Week 8 of our Government Contracting Webinar Series. We're coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and thanks again for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing the Veteran Certification, but before we dig into that, I just wanted to remind everybody all of our webinars are complimentary and they are all recorded. The full list can be found on our website, and there's a webinar section that you can click on. The full schedule is there, and then the recordings are below the schedule. The rest of this week, we are covering the management section of the proposal, ITAR, GDPR, and other topics related to government contracting. A little bit about us: we provide various services for contractors all over the world, both product and service companies, ranging from capability statement, 8A certification, GSA schedules, contract compliance, and other services. Our networking events and seminars can be found on our website, or you can also sign up for our newsletter, which now reaches 11,000 government contractors' unique email addresses. A little bit about me on this slide, but more importantly, I'd rather dig into Milt Johns, who's kind enough to share his time and knowledge with us today regarding the Veteran Certification. So thanks, Milt, so much for joining us. I'm excited to hear your presentation, and I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. Very briefly about me, I have been practicing law for over 19 years, but perhaps more importantly, I've spent almost 32 years in the government and defense contracting arena. I was a government contractor before I went to law school at George Mason University, and so the perspective I bring is not just the legal angle, but also the real-world business considerations. So about our firm, we are a values-based law firm focused on middle-market companies, and we are a full-service firm. Our clients are not exclusively government contracting companies, but the majority of our clients are in the government contracting space. So we're going to talk about the Veterans Business Certification process today. So very briefly, we have a history here on this chart of preferences for procurement, in procurement for veteran-owned firms. And as you can see, from 99 through to 2006, Congress expanded the opportunities for veteran-owned businesses to have preferences in procurement. That started with the 3% goals for veteran-owned businesses, and then the addition of the service-disabled veteran-owned small business concerns procurement programs. So as you can see, Congress has made the commitment to provide opportunities for veterans and veteran-owned companies to participate in the federal procurement process. So to be eligible for these set-asides, you and your firm must meet certain criteria. So a service-disabled veteran, as we mentioned here on the slide, is an individual with a service-connected disability determined by the Department of Veterans Affairs or Department of Defense. This may be evidenced on your DD-214. It may be in an adjudication letter from the Veterans Administration. There are several ways that you can receive that confirmation that, in fact, a veteran has a service-connected disability. Anecdotally, I have seen situations where a veteran with a 0% disability rating will receive this certification. So there's no requirement that a veteran be more than 10% disabled or 50% disabled, just some service-connected disability that's been adjudicated by the Veterans Affairs, Department of Veterans Affairs, or DOD. So that is the first criteria to meet. The business must also be small. Now, whether a business is small is going to depend on which NAICS code, North American Industry Classification System, is assigned to a given procurement. These may range from $5 million to $20 million. Sometimes the NAICS code will be driven by the number of employees. But the bottom line is that a company may be small for some procurements and not small for other procurements. So the two things that I think are most important to take away from our chat this morning are the issues of ownership and control. So the service-disabled veteran, or a combination of service-disabled veterans, must unconditionally own 51% of the SDVOSB. And when we say unconditionally own, they must hold that ownership without any restrictions, without any conversion of equity. It must be unconditionally owned. Now, you can have two service-disabled veterans who together own more than 51% of the company. That will still qualify, but you must have that unconditional ownership of 51%. The second criteria is that the service-disabled veteran must control the management and daily operations of the business. So ownership and control, we'll talk about them again momentarily, are the two most important concerns when agencies such as the Veterans Administration or Department of Defense would look at whether or not the organization meets the criteria. And then, of course, the service-disabled veteran must hold the highest office in the company. So the Veterans Administration has a formalized certification process. It's called the Vets First Verification Program. This program ensures that the funds are awarded to legitimate firms owned and controlled by veterans and service-disabled veterans. The process is run through the Center for Verification and Evaluation, CVE, that verifies that all of the subject entities meet all the requirements for ownership, eligibility, and control. So to participate in the Veterans Administration, the entity, the SDVOSB, the proposed SDVOSB must be verified first. There are a number of things that the Veterans Administration looks for, and there's a formalized submission process to follow, but the main focus by the Veterans Administration are these issues of eligibility, ownership, and control. Is the entity owned more than 51% by a service-disabled veteran? Does that service-disabled veteran control the entity, have complete management control? So the Veterans Administration is a formalized process. For Department of Defense procurements or other non-VA federal procurements, there's no formal certification process. You, as the entity owner or as the entity, would self-certify in SAM, the System for Award Management, as part of the company's representations and certifications. And these reps and certs, as we call them by shorthand, are revisited annually. So there isn't a formalized process for procurement other than Department of Defense to certify to be a veteran-owned business or a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. However, it's still important that all of those criteria are met, because that could become an issue with in the event that there's a protest of a procurement. And more I am seeing losing firms protest to SBA on the basis of SDVOSB status in these set-aside procurements. So the issue of ownership and control, then, I wanted to spend just a little bit more time to dig a little deeper to help understand what the issues are. So on the issue of control, the management and daily business operations of the concern must be controlled by one or more service-disabled veterans. Okay, so we're talking about the long-term decision-making and the day-to-day management and administration of business operations. This sometimes can be a challenge when growing veteran-owned businesses or service-disabled veteran-owned businesses look for opportunities to bring in venture capital. Venture capitalists like to have control over their money, as we can all imagine. However, some of their control provisions may, in fact, violate the control requirement for the certification of a veteran-owned or service-disabled veteran-owned business. So the control has to include both the long-term decision-making and the day-to-day management and administration of the business. There are some exceptions. If you have a service-disabled veteran with permanent and severe disability, the spouse or permanent caregiver of that veteran may make those management and daily business operations on behalf of the service-disabled veteran. And as I mentioned here, non-SDV investors or partners cannot reserve, and I've used quotes, important decisions. If they are important decisions, they must be made by the veteran or the service-disabled veteran. And then finally, on the issue of ownership, again, 51% must be of the company must be owned by the service-disabled veteran or more than one service-disabled veteran, as long as the total ownership percentage is over 51%. Now, there are multiple forms that you can take to create the entity. It can be a corporation, it can be a limited liability company, but those questions are for another webinar on another time. But suffice it to say that that the entity can be a corporation or a limited liability company as long as 51% of the ownership is reserved to veterans or service-disabled veterans. And then the last major issue I wanted to address is the question of affiliation. Now, affiliation affects whether or not a business is small, and in particular, it can affect service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. So affiliation exists when one business controls or has the power to control another, or when a third party controls or has the power to control both businesses. Control can arise through a number of factors. Typically, ownership and management are the most common, but you may also have affiliation through family relations. Husband and wife, father and son may create affiliations that affect whether or not a business is small. And so on the last bullet point, if a small business is deemed to be affiliated with another business, whether small or large, the revenue from both concerns are aggregated and the business may exceed procurement thresholds. So the main point of this issue, or of discussing this issue of affiliation, is that in addition to ownership and control, the concern, the service-disabled veteran-owned small business concern, must be small. And so if there are issues with the principal owning other businesses or investor businesses having control positions in other companies, these can affect and jeopardize the certification of the business as being small. Again, when SBA looks at control and the issue of affiliation, you can have negative or affirmative control. Negative control, as we say, includes instances where a minority shareholder has the ability under the charters, the concern's charter bylaws or shareholder agreement to prevent a quorum or otherwise block action by boards of directors or shareholders. I have seen, for instance, the CVE reject operating agreements where a venture capital firm, as a minority shareholder in a veteran-owned business, reserved the right to veto or approve certain expenditures. CVE said that that created, that was a negative control that affected the the ownership and control of the company, but also created an affiliation issue. So the conclusion here is that SBA considers the totality of the circumstances when determining whether affiliation exists. No single factor alone may be sufficient to constitute affiliation, but a combination of factors may constitute affiliation. And again, as we mentioned before, if SBA finds that the businesses are affiliated, they will count their revenues together for the purposes of determining whether a business continues to be small. So that completes our presentation this morning. It was an overview of the Veterans Business Certification process. Certainly, if you have any questions, you have our contact information. Feel free to reach out to Jennifer or to me.
Milt, thanks so much for a great and clear and concise presentation on the Veterans Certification. Thanks to all of our attendees who joined us today. This presentation was recorded, and the recording will be available later today on our website. As I mentioned, the rest of this week and for another 2 weeks, we are covering more topics in government contracting. We'll dig into GSA schedules, sole source contracts, and the SBA certification over the next 2 weeks. GDPR and ITAR this week in the management section of the proposal. Thanks again, Milt, and thanks again, everybody. This concludes our session for today.